Okay, so hello everybody and thank you for being here today. It's nice to see people from Lancashire are in attendance because Lancashire is going to feature prominently in today's talk. And so the title of my talk today is In the Murk of Pendle Hill, a Crone, Lancashire Gothic and the Lancashire Witches in 21st century literature. More than 400 years after their trial, the 12 accused people, known as the Pendle Witches, occupy an ambiguous and an enigmatic place in Lancashire's folklore, local history, and as well, they occupy quite a prominent place in literature and popular culture. And so this talk will consider fictionalizations of the Pendle Witches in Mary Sharratt's Daughters of the Witching Hill, Jeanette Winterson's The Daylight Gate, and Stacey Hall's The Familiars. Primarily, I will draw from Catherine Spooner's work on Lancashire Gothic to demonstrate how these 21st century novels correspond with this regional Gothic genre. And I will also discuss the feminist thought that is present in these narratives of the accused, marginalised women of Pendle. So I'm going to be talking about Pendle, which is an area in Lancashire, and I wanted to just show a map just to make sure that people knew exactly where I was referencing and talking about today. So here is a map, and there you can see where Pendle Hill is. So we're in the northwest of England. And so, as I mentioned, the title of this talk, In the Murk of Pendle Hill, a Crone, is taken from Carol Ann Duffy's 2012 poem, The Lancashire Witches, and this was written to mark the 400th anniversary of the trial. Duffy's poem is a sympathetic account of the experience of the people who were accused of witchcraft in 1612, and it highlights the cruelty and the injustices faced by those who were accused. The stanzas of this poem actually feature on 10 monuments across Lancashire, and that is a stretch that makes up the Lancashire Witches Walk, which is a 51-mile long-distance walk between Barrowford and Lancaster in Lancashire, England. And so on the left-hand side here, the bottom image is a photograph of one of these monuments, and I took this outside Lancaster Castle in Lancaster. And this is the location where the accused were jailed and tried. And on the top of these monuments, there is the stanza of the poem, and the Witches 400 is to mark the 400th anniversary. And then the image above that is from inside Lancaster Castle. It's of an exhibition that is there to mark the Pendle Witch trial. And again, the poem features underneath the display of the hanged women. And so this is actually the location where the people who were accused were held for 5 months from April to August 1612. And Duffy's poem emphasises the centrality of poverty and superstition in the trial itself. The second stanza, which I've highlighted in bold, particularly alludes to the gendered associations of the accusations, as more women were affected than men in this instance. The myth of the burning times, an academically discredited notion that the early modern witch trials were gendered genocide that were enacted to eradicate powerful women from society. So this was a popular myth or a popular notion during the second wave feminist movement. And the figure of the witch had been used to articulate feminist concerns about the persecution and oppression of women. Justina Sempruck, in her book Fantasies of Gender and the Witch in Feminist Theory and Literature from 2008, traces the radical feminist adoption of the witch in the later decades of the 20th century. And Semprook notes how the figure of the witch appealed to feminists, and she became a signifier for physically abused and culturally neglected women, and she represented women's struggle against conventional man. And we see this sentiment in 21st century works as well, and it does occur in these novels that I'll be discussing today about the Pendle Witch trials. So due to being recorded by Thomas Potts, the trial of the Pendle Witches is one of the best known witch trials in the early modern era of Europe. In early 1612, 12 people from the Pendle Hill area of Pendle, Lancashire, were accused of witchcraft, and they were charged with murdering 10 people by the use of witchcraft. The majority of people accused from Pendle were tried at the Lancaster Assizes on the 18th and 19th of August in 1612. But one person, Janet Preston, was actually sent to York. And of the 11 who went to trial, 9 being women and 2 men, 10 were found guilty and executed by hanging, and 1 was found not guilty. So Anne Whittle, who was known as Mother Chattox, her daughter Anne Redfern, Elizabeth Devis, Alison Devis, James Devis, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, who was known as Mould Heels, and Jane and John Bulcock were all hanged at Gallows Hill in Lancaster. Elizabeth Southerns, who is known as Old Demdike, she was the mother of Elizabeth Devis and grandmother to Alison and James, died in jail awaiting trial. She was in her 80s. And notably, many of the allegations of witchcraft were made by the members of these 2 families against each other. But how did this begin? Well, James Sharp, in his introduction to the 2002 book, The Lancashire Witches, Histories and Stories, which is edited by Robert Poole, explains that it was events that occurred on the 21st of March, 1612, that prompted the accusations and the subsequent trials. So it was on this day in March that Alison Devis met the peddler John Law and asked him for pins. And to add context, Joyce Froome, in her 2010 work, A History of the Pendle Witches and Their Magic, Wicked Enchantments, explains that in the 17th century, pins were handmade and they were very expensive to buy. And she also notes that they were often said to be used for magical practices, and these are concerned with healing, divination, and love magic. So there is the possibility that Alison wanted to purchase them for mending clothes, for example, and there's also the possibility that she wanted to acquire them for other means. And so when Alison met John Law, she said she wished to buy the pins from him. And this is something that's contested by John Law's son, Abraham, who said that Alison was actually begging for the pins. Either way, she did not get any pins, and John Law became unwell and he fell. And we understand now that John Law suffered a stroke, but at the time it was believed that he had been cursed and that there was malicious intention from Alison. And initially, Law didn't actually accuse Alison of witchcraft, but Alison later confessed to wrongdoing and she asked Law for forgiveness. So Alison, James, and Elizabeth Devis were summoned to appear before Roger Nowell, who was local justice of the peace, on the 30th of March, 1612. And it was at this meeting that Alison confessed that she had sold her soul to the devil and that she had told him to lame John Law when he called her a thief. Her brother James said that his sister had also confessed to bewitching a local child. And Elizabeth reported that her own mother, Old Demdike, had a witch's mark, and that's a bodily mark that witch hunters would have used as proof that somebody was a witch. And at this same meeting, Alison also accused Chattox of witchcraft, and she accused Chattox of killing their father, John Devis, by witchcraft. On the 2nd of April 1612, Demdike, Chattox and Chattox's daughter Anne Redfern were summoned to appear before Noel. And Demdike and Chattox themselves made various confessions and accusations against each other. And then a little later on Good Friday, the 10th of April, 1612, it was believed that there was a witches' gathering at Malkin Tower in Pendle. It had variously been described as a black mass or like a Sabbath meeting. And an inquiry about this followed on the 27th of April. And as a result of this inquiry, 8 more people, Elizabeth Devis, James Devis, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, John Bulcock, Jane Bulcock, Alice Gray and Janet Preston, were accused of witchcraft, and they were committed for trial. And during the trials themselves, it was the 9-year-old Janet Devis, daughter of Elizabeth Devis and younger sister to Alison and James, who was a key witness for the prosecution. Janet identified attendees of this Good Friday Malkin Tower meeting, and she also gave evidence against her own family members. And it was in King James's Demonology, which was a text that heavily influenced the Lancashire witch trials, that he explains that in instances of witchcraft being brought to trial, he thought that the normal rules of evidence should be suspended, and this perhaps accounts for why Janet Devis was relied upon as a witness when she was only a child. And it's in Demonology that King James writes about magic, sorcery, witchcraft, demons, and he endorsed witch hunting. And he himself had been heavily influenced by the witch hunts in Denmark and also by the North Berwick witch trials of 1590, which he was actually personally involved with. During his reign, King James had to contend with many religious tensions and issues. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, that was the 3rd Catholic conspiracy against James in a 3-year period, and this led to increased anti-Catholic sentiment and legislation against English Catholics. Even after the English Reformation of the 16th century, in which the Church of England broke away from the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, Lancashire was considered a stronghold of Catholicism. Hasted notes that Lancashire at this time was regarded as being a wild and lawless region, fabled for its theft, violence, and sexual laxity. And on top of this, Catholic masses continued to be practiced in secret, and it was a crime to miss a church service. So there was the opportunity there for the authorities to punish local people who did not go to church. So in the novels that I'll discuss in a moment, the accused Lancashire witches are all associated with Catholicism. And so this religious context is of great importance to these narratives. And many cultural depictions of the Pendle Witches characterise them as secretly being Catholic, people who remained faithful to the old religion in accordance with this religious context of Lancashire. And novelisations similarly allude to the perception of Lancashire as being a very wild and lawless place. In her discussion of regionalism, folklore, and Elizabeth Gaskell's Northern Gothic, Catherine Spooner introduces the concept of Lancashire Gothic. And that's a Gothic that is not just Northern, but it is specifically Lancashire. So Spooner writes, place is constructed not just through landscape, but also through the accumulation of legends and folklore that inform local identity. And the Pendle Witches and the story of the Pendle Witches contributes to this sense of place. They remain a culturally relevant aspect of the Pendle landscape, and they are in various ways tied to the landscape, which is something we see in these novels. In her 2020 article, Lucifer over Lancashire, Spooner writes that the story of the Pendle Witches becomes bigger than a historical event. It becomes part of the folk culture of Lancashire and beyond, influencing writers and artists, from Elizabeth Gaskell to Paula Rego. She notes that the Pendle Witches have become a kind of folk hero, explaining that when the 400-year anniversary of the witch trials came round in 2012, it was the notion of the witches as folk heroes that caught the popular imagination. These were influenced by the more enlightened attitudes towards exclusion and marginalisation, developed by feminism, disability studies, and other forms of cultural criticism. Specifically, she writes, in novels like Mary Sharratt's Daughters of the Witching Hill and Jeanette Winterson's The Daylight Gate, the witches are proto-feminists, women who are persecuted for their solidarity with other women, their unconventional lifestyles, and their access to knowledge. And I wanted to include a kind of overview of different literary and popular culture accounts of the Pendle Witch trials or of the Lancashire witch trials. And so in 1613, we have Thomas Potts, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the county of Lancaster. And this was the record of what happened during the trials. It was purported to be verbatim from the trials. However, it's been acknowledged that Thomas Potts perhaps coloured this with his own biases, his own attitudes towards witches and Catholics. And in 1849, we have The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest by William Harrison Ainsworth, and that is a novel. And that is the novel that has inspired the conference that Sam was talking about, and it will be happening the last weekend of August. And you can find out more about that from the link in the chat. In 1951, there is the novel Mist over Pendle by Robert Neal. And then in 1996, there's the Pendle Witches poems by Blake Morrison. And these were accompanied by artwork by Paula Rego, called The Pendle Witches. And then into the 21st century, in 2010, we have The Daughters of the Witching Hill by Mary Sharratt. In 2011, there is the BBC documentary The Pendle Witch Child, which focuses on the aspect of Janet, the young child, providing testimony that the trials were really hinged upon. And in 2012, the 400th year of the Pendle Witch trials, there were quite a few works. So The Witch and Her Soul by Christine Middleton, The Daylight Gate by Jeanette Winterson, The Lancashire Witches by Carol Ann Duffy, and Malkin Child, A Story of Pendle's Witches by Livy Michaels. Published in 2010, Mary Sharratt's Daughters of the Witching Hill constructs the first-person accounts of Elizabeth Bess Southerns and her daughter Alison Devis. Bess details the realities of life as a poor Catholic woman in 17th century Pendle, touching upon the religious intolerance and social inequality experienced by many like herself in the area. Bess declares, "Throughout Pendle Forest, I'm known as a cunning woman." And this self-identification as a cunning woman, also known as a folk healer, distances her from any kind of ideas of diabolical witchcraft or, villainous witchcraft. And this is an important distinction that Sharratt makes, and it serves to rehabilitate old Demdike by positioning her as a sympathetic character, Bess, and not as a villain. So we learn that Bess retained her Catholic faith, expressing, "My soul's home was not with this harsh new God, but instead I sought the solace of the Queen of Heaven and whispered the Salve Regina in secret. I swore to cling to the forbidden prayers until my dying day." Catholicism is a source of power for Bess. She is able to heal others by reciting Latin Catholic prayers to the Virgin Mary. And there is also the character of Tib, who is Bess's spirit familiar, and he takes the form of a young man that appears to her and guides her. And he tells Bess that her faith will do miracles. And Bess's combination of folk medicine, her knowledge of herbs, and these Catholic prayers lift curses, and they heal the people in her community when they fall ill. And all of Pendle comes to Bess for help, as her reputation as a healer and a cunning woman is strengthened by the many successes that she has. Bess becomes an authority on reproductive issues too, and she helps local women either conceive or terminate their pregnancies. And this corresponds with a popular trend of portraying witches as being midwives or people who would issue women with herbs and medicines that would bring on an abortion. And so as a result of Bess's reputation, she's called upon to assist Alice Nutter, whose name you might recognise. She was also involved in the real Pendle Witch trials. And Alice is a member of a local wealthy family, and she's also a secret Catholic, and she's struggling to conceive a baby. And Bess helps Alice by enabling her to successfully conceive children. But she also places emphasis on Alice's pleasure and her sexual pleasure. Bess provides her with a herbal medicine, and she says, "This is for you, to turn your heart to delight. You'll not conceive a child unless you get some pleasure from the act." And Bess's emphasis on women's pleasure corresponds with Spooner's assertion that the Pendle Witches are shown to be proto-feminists. They show solidarity with the other women. And in her 2023 book, Feminist Afterlives of the Witch, Bridie Cosminer notes how witches have come to embody a sort of feminist activism. I'm going to read a quote from that book now. That so many feminists writing popular cultural criticism and political polemic have fixated on the notion of the witch as midwife is indicative of how the past is remembered in activist work as a political strategy for the present. Witches being persecuted as midwives and abortionists offers a powerful corollary to contemporary reproductive rights activism in the 20th century. And in this novel, Bess's solidarity with other women, her emphasis on pleasure and women's experience, and her ability to help women acquire a degree of reproductive agency corresponds with 20th and 21st century feminist concerns. And similar to this, Bess actually uses her power to try and enact retribution on sexual predators. When the wealthy Robert Ashton serially and violently attempts to rape Anne Whittle's daughter, Anne Whittle and her daughter go to Bess for help, and Bess, as a poor Lancashire woman with extraordinary power, is called upon then to protect other vulnerable women. She reasons, "It seemed there was no justice in sight for Annie. Robert Ashton had acted as he had because he knew he could get away with it. The law of the land protected only the rich. Rocking my friend in my arms, I sought to give her what solace I could. We were just two lowly old women. How could we hope to stand up to the gentry?" Bess believes that magic is the only power a low-born woman such as she could wield, and the only way retribution could be brought down upon Robert Ashton. So Bess teaches Chattox how to bind Robert Ashton using a kind of sympathetic magic, a clay figure that represents Robert Ashton, and is then bound to prevent harm to other people. However, Chattox deems this an insignificant and insufficient act, and she actually takes this beyond protection, and she becomes a kind of vigilante, and she actually uses this magic to kill Robert Ashton and his father as well. And sexual assault and the threat of sexual assault is similarly alluded to in Jeanette Winterson's The Daylight Gate and in Hall's The Familiars. And Lyndall Roper explains that sexual violence was proactively used by witch hunters against women throughout the hunts. And the protagonists of these Pendle Witch fictions in the 21st century are shown to use their power, both social power and supernatural power, against these sexual predators and aggressors. And in this novel, the feminist power harnessed by Bess is passed down matrilineally. And the second part of The Daughters of the Witching Hill focuses on Alison Davis's account of the trials and the events preceding the trials. At age 16, Alison takes over from Bess as a cunning woman. Like her grandmother, she works to heal and help those who seek her assistance, working with good intentions and adhering to her grandmother's successful combination of herbal folk magic and Catholic prayer. Alison herself experiences sexual assault at the hands of Roger Nowell, as she is coerced by him prior to the trial. And Alison, like Bess, shares an affinity for the landscape. As she is led towards Lancaster for imprisonment and trial, she says, "Pendle Hill beckoned me like a mother." And in this novel, the witches have a deep connection with the landscape. In a literal sense, it is the means by which they acquire healing medicinal ingredients, but regionally, it allows them to sustain a connection to the old religion of Catholicism, which proves to be especially powerful. And towards the end of the novel, Alison says, "Roger Nowell would have everyone believe that Lancashire was fair bursting with Satan's army." The sympathetic characterization of Bess and of the Davises in this novel actually opposes Nowell's view that the women of Lancashire are diabolical and satanic. Sharratt's novel effectively characterizes two major figures from the real Pendle Witch trials as being victims of social inequality, religious persecution, and positions them as folk heroes of Pendle, as Spooner contends. Jeanette Winterson's 2012 novella, The Daylight Gate, commences with an introduction that provides historical context and clarification about the characters in the story. And I'm just going to read a very short passage from the already short introduction to give you a sense of what Winterson says. So Winterson writes, "The story I have told follows the historical account of the witch trials and the religious background, but with necessary speculations and inventions." She then goes on to say, "The places are real places: Reed Hall, the Roughly, Malkin Tower, New Church in Pendle, Whalley Abbey. The characters are real people, though I have taken liberties with their motives and their means. My Alice Nutter is not the Alice Nutter of history, though why that gentlewoman was tried for witchcraft along with the Demdike and Chattox riffraff remains a mystery. The story of Alice Nutter and Elizabeth Southern is an invention of my own and has no basis in fact." And she finishes her introduction by saying, "And Pendle Hill is still the enigma it ever was, though the Malkin Tower is long gone." Winterson begins by emphasising the wildness of Pendle, identifying the county of Lancashire as the wildest part of an untamed region. She writes, "The north is a dark place," and continues, "The north of England is untamed. It can be subdued, but it cannot be tamed. Lancashire is the wild part of the untamed." And as Sharratt did before her, Winterson personifies the landscape to some extent. And she writes, "The forest of Pendle used to be a hunting ground, but some say that the hill is the hunter." And in this novel, there is similarly an alignment between women and the wild landscape, perhaps to suggest or to allude to the wildness within these unconventional women. And while Sharratt characterises Alison Davis as a sympathetic character, Winterson characterises her much in accordance with belief at the time. And so in this novel, upon meeting the peddler John Law, Winterson's Alison taunts and curses him. It's a very different rendering of this famous event. And early on, it's clear that Alison will not be humanised in this narrative. Instead, it is the wealthy Alice Nutter who is afforded subjectivity, as Winterson constructs a narrative in which she is a saviour and she is sympathetic to the poor women of Pendle. Alice comes to the assistance of Sarah Davis near the beginning of this novel, when Sarah Davis is being humiliated and also sexually assaulted by two of the male characters. And later, Alice defends the Davises to Roger Noel. She says, "Such women are poor, they are ignorant, they have no power in your world, so they must get what power they can in theirs. I have sympathy for them." Alice is the folk hero in this narrative, acting as the protector of the poor accused women. Alice is also Catholic, and attitudes to Catholicism feature throughout, as witchcraft is aligned with popery. Reminded that the gunpowder plot conspirators fled to Lancashire, the character of Thomas Potts asks the Roger Noel character, "What is worse, sir, a high mass or a black mass? To practice witchcraft or to practice the old religion? Both are high treason against the crown. Witchery, popery, popery, witchery. What is the difference?" And in this story, the accused indeed practice witchcraft. And there is a scene where the Davis characters bewitch a skull to speak using the tongue that has been bitten out of a man. And they also use other charms and curses. Further to this, Alice, Nutter and Elizabeth Southern are portrayed as lovers, and they each have a relationship with the devil, who is referred to as the Dark Gentleman, in different and ambiguous ways. So even though Alice is, it's suggested that she has made a deal with the devil, she is still very much a sympathetic character, whereas this is not really the case for the Elizabeth Southern's character. And from this exchange, Alice actually obtains power, but also enduring youthfulness. So she appears very, very young, even in her old age. Writing a 2012 article for the Independent newspaper, witchcraft historian Diane Purkis writes that the Pendle Witches were innocent people who used tweaked Catholic prayers to cure diseases. Though, she says, nobody has ever wanted to tell this banal story. It is not even the story the first teller, Thomas Potts, wanted to tell. Purkis recognises that Winterson gives the witches real magical capabilities and a real devil for their dealings. She emphasises the Pendle Witches are not fictional characters, but real victims of cruel injustice. It's this tension that must be thoughtfully considered when we evaluate portrayals of the Pendle Witches and other people who were really involved in witch trials in popular culture. In The Daylight Gate, Alice Nutter may function as a folk hero, but other people in the narrative remain villainised. Stacey Hall's 2019 novel, The Familiars, tells the story of 17-year-old Fleetwood Shuttleworth, who is mistress of Gawthorpe Hall in Lancashire in 1612. Pregnant for the fourth time, having suffered 2 miscarriages and a stillborn child, Fleetwood feels the pressure to provide an heir for her family. When she meets the young, mysterious midwife Alice Gray, she requests that Alice help her through this pregnancy. In real life, Alice Gray was accused of witchcraft alongside Catherine Hewitt. They were accused of murdering someone called Anne Folds by witchcraft. And Alice was said to have been present at the Good Friday meeting at Malkin Tower, though Potts did not provide an account of Alice Gray's trial. She was included on the list of those found not guilty, though, which marks her as an interesting figure. In The Familiars, the character of Alice Gray appears to correspond with what we know about the real Alice Gray, but in the absence of testimony, Stacey Hall affords Alice a compelling, sympathetic story of her own. As has become more common since the latter half of the 20th century, Alex is characterised as a midwife, abortionist, healer-type witch. This corresponds with the cultural trend of portraying witches as benevolent women concerned with helping other women, and Alice, like Bess from the Daughters of the Witching Hill, functions as a cunning woman rather than as a stereotypical or diabolical witch. And in this novel, Lancashire's reputation as a wild and unruly place is alluded to early on. Witch hunting is positioned as a method by which Lancashire can win back the sympathies of King James. Early in the narrative, Roger Nowell says, "And you may have heard the whisperings about some of the traitors escaping to Lancashire. Something must be done to demonstrate the county's loyalty to the crown, because currently the king is very mistrustful of our little part of the north and the lawless people within it. He thinks us a pack of animals compared to the genteel lords and ladies of the south." Again, the lawlessness of Lancashire is emphasised as the county is perceived as being a county of witches and Catholics. And again, witches become aligned with Catholicism, and the persecution of women parallels the persecution of English Catholics. As with Bess and Alison in Daughters of the Witching Hill, this Alice Gray embodies a contemporary feminism. She tells Fleetwood that she doesn't wish to marry, and she states, "It's the same life for a daughter as it is for a wife, just a different man telling you what to do." Alice's profession, her views, her solidarity with Fleetwood, and her ties with the other Pendle women who were also accused position her as a folk hero proto-feminist, in line with Spooner's view of the characters in Sharratt's and Winterson's works. Hall's sympathetic account of Alice's involvement with those associated with the Pendle trials speaks to an enduring curiosity about the lives of those implicated. As Hall's writes in the historical notes section at the end of her novel, why Alice was the only one of the Pendle witches to be acquitted remains a mystery. And so we see this as being very similar to the sentiment that Jeanette Winterson expresses in her introduction to The Daylight Gate, when she expresses surprise at the fact that Alice Nutter, someone of the gentry, was included in these trials with these very poor women. And it is the mystery of these trials and the women involved that has afforded writers the opportunity to create and articulate narratives about persecution and equality. And in these three novels, Lancashire Gothic is evoked, communicating folkloric regional identity, and also the witch figure functions as a vehicle through which feminism is considered and enacted in the face of persecution. Elizabeth Lee's 2021 novel, Cunning Women, has the subtitle, "A Feminist Tale of Forbidden Love After the Witch Trials." Set in Lancashire in 1620, the narrative focuses on Sarah and her family, who are outcasts and cunning folk. They are subjected to the attention of a new magistrate, and the novel imagines a fictional witch hunt in the wake of Pendle. Though Lee's narrative is not based on historical events, there was actually another Lancashire witch trial after the Pendle witch trial of 1612. And in these Lancashire witch trials of 1633, Janet Davis, who was the child who provided the witness testimony in the Pendle witch trials, actually was accused of witchcraft herself, and she was one of 20 people who were tried at the Lancaster Assizes. And while these people weren't executed for witchcraft, it is believed that they died while imprisoned. And a play about this, titled The Late Lancashire Witches, written by Thomas Hayward and Richard Brome, was published in 1634 and performed in August that year. The trial of the other Lancashire witches, however, has not captured the cultural imagination quite in the same way that the Pendle witches have. To date, there has been no apology or pardon made for the innocent people convicted and hanged for witchcraft in the Pendle witch trials. A 2022 petition requesting a monarch's pardon for those hanged gained 2,809 signatures, and it coincided with the Blackpool Tower Dungeon's pardon for the Pendle Witches campaign, and that is an image on the left-hand side there from that campaign. In spite of this, the Blackpool Tower Dungeons features 2 witch-related shows, so make of that what you will. And in Lancaster and Pendle, and in other places in Lancashire as well, there are many of these tourist signs that show a stereotypical witch flying on a broomstick, and they're used to point out places of interest. And those who were accused and executed are still generally referred to as the Pendle Witches, often without irony and without quotation marks, which I think is something that people should think about. You know, these were not witches, they were women, people accused of witchcraft. And now our understanding of witchcraft has changed since the 17th century. Perhaps the terminology should as well. And like I said, today we acknowledge that those accused were not witches. They didn't fly on broomsticks. They probably didn't curse their neighbours or sell their souls to the devil. So why are they still referred to as such? And what power does this image of the hag on a broomstick hold? And what do these signs suggest? And when it comes to representing the Pendle Witches in literature and in culture more generally, what responsibility do we have when it comes to further villainising already villainised figures? And in fictionalising historical figures by turning them into magical healers or diabolical witches, we utilise them to articulate contemporary agendas. But what do we gain from this, and what do we risk? Thank you for listening.